Hi, glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. Have a good view. Night fighting on the Western Front. In April 1942, the Mosquito NF-2 was available in 2 squadrons, but in both units only a few crews had time to master the new technique. The beginning of the Luftwaffe's Baedeker raids by cities from Baedeker's tourist guidebook, which forced the British to throw all available forces into the battle, did not allow them to continue training quietly. The first combat use of Mosquito fighters was the participation of 3 planes of the 157th Squadron in the reflection of the raid on Norwich on the night of April 28th. After returning to base, the pilots reported several contacts with the enemy, which were lost before they were able to reach the firing line. 2 days later, 151 Squadron also made its first Mosquito combat sortie. That same night, one of the crews of the 157th almost managed to catch up with Do-217, but under the moonlight, the Germans noticed the danger in time and left the pursuit dive. Exactly 1 month later, on the night of May 30th, Squadron leader Glyn Ashfield of the same 157 Squadron managed to score the first confirmed Mosquito air victory, shooting down a Do-217E of KG-2 off the Dover coast. On the same night, Flight Lieutenant Dennis A. Pennington of the 151st had to open another list, a list of fighters of this type that suffered from enemy fire. He attacked and managed to set fire to a He-111H, but he himself came under the accurate fire of an air gunner who knocked out one engine of the interceptor, after which the opponents went their separate ways. The second success Mosquitoes achieved only on the night of June 25th, when the crew of the commander of 151 Squadron Wing Commander, Irving S. Smith. Smith had a very troublesome sortie. At 23:30, he intercepted a He-111H-6 from the 17th Instructional and Experimental Team, and closing to 300 yards, opened fire, taking a number of hits that sent a plume of gasoline from the punctured tanks behind the aircraft. Nevertheless, the enemy managed to dive away and landed safely in the Netherlands, but lost one crew member jumped out with a parachute when a fire started on board and died at sea. At 23:40, the second act began with the interception of another HE-111. In reality, it was a Do-217E4 of 2 KG-40, attacking at 100 yards and dropping the burning bomber into the water. 8 minutes later, the operator found a new target. This time, the pilot opened fire from 200 yards, taking numerous hits on the wings, which caused the gas tanks to explode and started a fire. Nevertheless, the Do-217E4 of 1 KG-2 continued to fly horizontally until another accurate line fired at point-blank range sent it into an uncontrollable descent. Sometime earlier, on June 13th, the 264th Squadron had also begun combat sorties on Mosquitoes, and on the night of the 29th, one of its crews was close to success in pursuit of a Do-217E2 of KG-2. The British hit the bomber, but were unable to finish it off. It plopped down later on a forced landing in France. Therefore, the official opening of the squadron's combat account after the rearmament to twin-engined aircraft was the Ju-88A4 of KGR-1106, shot down on the night of July 31st by squadron leader Charles A. Cook, former commander of the squadron. Cook, a former commander who had been demoted to fly commander due to the squadron's conversion to a multi-engine staff. Among other things, this Junkers was the first Mosquito victim to crash directly onto British soil, rather than falling into the sea or crashing on return to base. The 23rd Intruders in turn began combat sorties on the new type on the night of July 6th. The only NF-2 special at the time was flown by Unit Commander Wing Commander Bertie R.O.B. Hoare. The flight was uneventful, and the following night, the same crew managed to open the Mosquito Intruder victory count by reporting the destruction of a Do-217 over France. That same month, on the night of the 29th, another crew from the same squadron, Flight Sergeant Kenneth J. O. Hawkins and Navigator Sergeant Eric C. Gregory, opened the type's irrecoverable combat casualty count by failing to return from an intruder raid over Holland. And a similar operation on September 8-9 cost the squadron 3 aircraft at once and set an anti-record for daily losses of Mosquito fighters during combat sorties, broken only in the summer of 1944. Intruder, for obvious reasons, was a very dangerous business in general. Operations over enemy territory meant a threat from enemy anti-aircraft guns and fighters, in addition to the usual dangers of night flying and defensive fire from German gunners, and the obviously long distances left less chance for a damaged machine to reach the nearest base and complicated the work of the search and rescue service. Therefore, it is not surprising that the relative losses in offensive operations constantly exceeded those in defensive operations. Moreover, up to November 1943, in intruder sorties, the number of aircraft lost for all reasons exceeded the number of air victories declared by pilots, not to mention the number of enemy aircraft actually shot down. However, the absolute values of losses still did not reach an unacceptable level, and intruder operations continued on an ever-increasing scale, favoring the reduction in the activity of German bomber aviation allowed to allocate more and more aircraft to such missions. Initially, intruder crews were aimed at intercepting bombers returning from raids on England at their own bases, but in 1943, new variations of this tactic emerged. For example, the Rangers were no longer tied to repelling German raids, but spent free hunting in specified areas, attacking both air and ground targets. And the Day Rangers, unlike the Night Rangers, focused on attacking mainly steam locomotives and automobiles, leaving the fight with aircraft to the share of single-seat fighters. The third type of intruderism was instep, daytime patrols over the sea off the coast of France to cover Coastal Command anti-submarine planes from German frontline and heavy fighters. Similar to such sorties, raids to the coast of Norway were informally referred to as outsteps. Two more types of missions, Flower and Mahmoud, corresponded to sorties in support of the actions of their own bombers. The first denoted strikes on airfields of German night fighters, and the second performed exclusively by radar fighters, following the mainstream of bombers to lure the enemy interceptors and tie them up in combat. The next step in the development of this idea was the inclusion of several night fighter squadrons in the 100th Group of Bomber Command. In December 1943, 141st and 239th were transferred there, 169th was formed, and 515th was transformed from experimental to combat. In May 1944, the 85th and 157th Squadrons were added to this force, and in July 23rd, already mentioned above restrictions on the use of radar in intruder operations strictly observed, but with the increasing percentage of fighters of late modifications in the combat formation, it threatened to become a hindrance to the coming flights to support the landing in Normandy, and then the troops on the continent. Therefore, in May 1944, when the preparation of the Operation Overlord entered the final stage, the crews of Mosquito NF-12 and 13 began unauthorized raids over France. But still, aircraft with AI Mach-10 began such flights only in June, after the landing, when all bans were officially lifted. The high speed of the Mosquitoes ensured that they could successfully intercept any enemy scout or bomber, with the exception of the high-altitude Ju-86 and jet-powered Me-262 and R-234. On fighter bombers, FW-190 and Me-410 Wooden Miracle also worked quite successfully even in the conditions of duty on the ground. But in this case, the interception required constant operation of engines in the mode of maximum continuous power and clear actions of both the crew of the interceptor and the staff of the ground guidance stations. Otherwise, the Germans had time to hit and run. But the interception of airplane shells, in which Mosquito participated throughout the entire time of use of this weapon by the Germans, was possible only when on duty in the air and required mandatory acceleration on dive and a very accurate calculation of the time of attack, and in case of success was fraught with explosion on the downed FOW-1. This problem was faced by the first Mosquito winner of the flying bomb, pilot instructor of the 54th OTU flight officer Rain D. Schultz, who shot down the airplane. Schultz, who shot down the bomber plane on the night of June 15, 1944, and returned to the airfield with the skin almost completely burned. However, such a danger was commonplace in intercepting bombers. But there the main threat was not the explosion as such, but the collision with the wreckage, which cost the British at least a dozen lost Mosquito, and these are only those episodes when there was someone to report on the circumstances of the battle. The above-mentioned was about night actions, and day actions were easier on the one hand, because everything was visible, but on the other hand more complicated and dangerous for the same reason. And if day rangers and intruders when meeting with enemy fighters had every right to simply run away, then instep, for example, was aimed precisely at air combat, and their statistics looks bleak for the British. Despite the obvious advantage in flight data Mosquito compared to the Ju-88C, the overall result of their battles in the daylight hours was a German victory on points, which is strikingly different from the results of night air battles of the same types of fighters. And if it came to meetings with FW-190, the Mosquitoes from hunters turned into victims and were defeated with a dry score. Accordingly, Mosquito, being an excellent attack aircraft and night fighter, as a day fighter showed itself not the best way, and could successfully work only on scouts and bombers of the enemy. It coped mediocrely with the fight with similar Zerstörer, and against single-engine Jaegers was simply helpless. Overseas and Lend-Lease Mosquito. Unlike the Mosquito bombers, which in World War II fought only on the Western Front, the geography of application of night fighters of the same family was wider. Over the sea, they first appeared in December 1942, when the 23rd Squadron flew from England to Malta. In the new location, this unit continued to perform intruder missions, first on radarless NF TOWs and then on the new FB PIGs, until it returned back to the metropolis in May 1944. The second overseas was the 256th, which in July 1943 sent a single flyby to Malta to provide air defense for the Sicilian landing force, and in October moved there in its entirety. Flying NF-12 and 13, it initially flew only air defense missions, and in the fall of 1944 switched to intruder flying. In 1944, the arrival of Mosquitoes also began in some other Mediterranean squadrons. Two of them then received a small number of NF-12 and 13 in addition to the old bow fighters, but used them not too long, no more than half a year. And in the winter of 1944-1945, two more squadrons of bow fighters were fully rearmed with Mosquito NF-19, and since March, the Commonwealth night fighter aviation in the Mediterranean theater also became all Mosquito, but shrunk at the same time from 9 squadrons at the peak of numbers in October 1943 to 3 at the end of the war. The coloring and designations of the Mediterranean Mosquito fighters remained the same as in the West, and the only theater difference, and even that is not widespread, can be called red coquettes and black code letters on some machines. In total, during combat sorties over the Mediterranean islands, North Africa, Italy, the Balkans, and southern France, the crews of Mosquito fighters won about 70 air victories, 50 of which occurred in 1943. Own irrecoverable losses amounted to just over 40 machines, half of which also came in 1943. Since the same year 1943, 4 American night fighter squadrons fought side by side with the British in the Mediterranean. All of them flew bow fighters, until the winter-spring of 1945 did not move to more modern equipment. 3 of them were rearmed on the Black Widow, and the 416th NFS became twice unique, the only American unit of the first line armed with Mosquito fighters and the only user of the NF-30 model in the Mediterranean theater. It received the first few machines of this type in November 1944, and in December began using them in combat sorties. In January-February 1945, the 5 aircraft detachment of the unit fought on the Western Front, operating under the operational command of the 425th Squadron. But due to organizational miscalculations, this assignment was not very successful. But the main field of action of the unit both then and later remained northern Italy, where the pilots conducted intruder raids night and in April 1945 daytime, as well as engaged in defensive patrols over their troops and interception sorties. In one of these, on the night of March 1st, Captain Lawrence E. Englert's crew scored the first and only aerial victory of the American Mosquitoes. However, the Yankees also lost their own machine, but not because of the enemy's actions. It all started at the stage of altitude gain, when the second stage of the supercharger of the right engine did not turn on, and then it failed altogether, and the final stage of the interception had to be carried out on a single engine. Nevertheless, the Ju-188 was successfully caught up and shot down. On the way back, the faulty engine suddenly burst into flames, and most of the instrumentation equipment failed. But the radio remained working, and by commands from the ground, the pilot managed to reach the airfield. But on landing, it turned out that the right leg of the landing gear was jammed, and the airplane could not be kept on a straight course. Therefore, after gaining the necessary altitude, the crew left the car. And in total, in combat sorties, 416th lost 6 Mosquito, all on the Italian front. The Americans left the British camouflage of their NF-30 unchanged, replacing only the cockades with stars and stripes in 4 positions, on the sides of the fuselage, on the left wing above and right below, and the tricolor on the tail could be painted over or left as it was. The 416th Squadron did not recognize onboard codes or tactical numbers, using British serial numbers as individual designations. In the Pacific, the British had only 2 night fighter squadrons. Both fought on Beaufighters, and in 1945 replaced them with Mosquito NF-19. 176th at the time of the Japanese surrender was just in the process of rearmament, and the 89th passed it from March to June, but did not return to the Burma front, and remained in the rear to wait for the start of the Malayan operation, which never took place because of the end of the war. Peacetime Air Force Service. After the end of hostilities, both Indian-Burmese night fighter squadrons continued to operate Mosquito NF-19s until disbanded in the first half of 1946. In the Mediterranean, the Americans were the first to get rid of the Mosquito, rearming the 416th NFS with P-61Bs in the summer of 1945, while the British also disbanded one of their 3 squadrons. In the fall, they rearmed the 256th with the NF-19, and in early 1946, they partially rearmed the 255th with the NF-30. However, both of these squadrons were disbanded in the same year. On the former Western Front, by the end of 1945, the number of squadrons was reduced from 18 to 7, but the aircraft of all early modifications were written off, leaving in the first-line units only machines Model 30, and during the next year, everywhere replaced them with machines of post-war production. In parallel, in 1946, disbanded 2 more squadrons, but created a new one. And as of January 1, 1947, Night Fighter Forces RAF consisted of 6 squadrons, 23rd former 219th, 25th, 29th, 85th, 141st, new, and 264th, former 125th, all on the Mosquito NF-36. And the old 30 in the same year staffed 7 squadrons of reservists and auxiliaries, 500th, 52nd, 504th, 605th, 608th, 609th, and 616th. But in the following year, all of them, except for the 616th, in 1949, were rearmed with single-seat fighters of different types, Spitfires, 16 and 22, Meteor, 3, and Vampire, 1. Meanwhile, the squadrons of the first line continued to operate the NF-36, but plans to switch to the NF-38 were abandoned due to the fact that this model had no particular advantages over its predecessors, but caused unnecessary problems with overweight and unreliable radar. Because of the shortage of 36th 29th Squadron in October 1950, had to return 30s, but not for too long, because on the way were already jet technology. Rearming of all Western units of the first line on new aircraft took place from July 1951 to June 1952, with the 23rd and 25th Squadrons received Vampires NF.10, and the rest received Meteors NF.12. After that, the piston-powered Nocturnals remained only in the Middle East. In 1949, due to growing tensions in the region, specifically to cover the Suez Canal area, formed the 39th Squadron, and 2 years later, another squadron, which was assigned the number 219. Both flew NF-36 Mosquitoes until they were rearmed with NF-13, Meteors in March 1953, thus ending the history of mosquito fighters in the RAF. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. See you soon.